thank you, Fancy, for those beautiful words, and thank you for inviting me tonight to be with you. I want to start by acknowledging that we are on the treaty and traditional territory of the Michi Island and Anishinaabe, and we offer our gratitude to the First People for their care, teaching, and our earth and our relations. May we honor these teachings. It's also a big honor to be invited to the David Morrison lecture. It means a lot to me, and also to start in this university that I have a lot of connections. I want to thank David Morrison, Ed Langer, Chris Bayer, Vladimir Joy, and Casey Bavan, and Michael Cohn for this invitation today. In my talk, I will focus on the relation between the crisis of sustainability and international development studies. I don't need to talk about crisis of sustainability of life today, because we just have the warmest summer in the history of records, not only in the northern hemisphere, but also in the southern hemisphere that was winter, like in Argentina, have a record temperatures. And we also witnessed the record number of fire in Canada. Also because environment is not my specialty, is development. But what I am going to talk is the relationship between those and the impact that this change is having, and I hope will continue having on development studies. Following Gramsci, he said that crises are when the old is dying and the new has not been born. We are happy because, unlike Gramsci thinking, the new is being born. Not totally, but we are seeing a lot of initiatives and answers to this crisis of life in the world. And mainly, I'm going to insist that not only, but mainly, we are seeing very important and innovative answers by indigenous people and afro descendants community. In this talk, I am going to refer mainly to the case of Latin America and Bolivia, because it's where I am doing my research, but the same we can say of Canada and the United States indigenous and Afro-descendant population. What I am going to do today is I'm going to divide, to look at how there are in development studies something that is dying, the old I call development studies, that are mainly approaches, I will argue, that think that there is only one world, and that world is mainly human world, ignoring nature. And I think that on the contrary, the new approaches, the new answers is precisely that no, there is no one world as we believe, but we are living in multiple worlds. And I think the international development studies has to be and is building relationship and answering to how we negotiate with other worlds and what language and what type of knowledge we need. Being here at Trent and in international development is important, and I hope at the end to talk more about that specific implications. I have divided the talk in three parts. In the first part, I am going to talk to early approaches of development that have this image of one world, and use as an example modernization theory and the answer from the South that was a dependent development, one with a liberal approach, the second with a Marxist approach. Then I am going to talk about my proposal about, I call, a complex development for a diverse and endangered world. And then I am going to talk about Bolivia and my experience in Bolivia, because I think Bolivia is one of the most successful and immense initiative from indigenous people. What you are going to learn and the impact that is going to have in your student is really immense. And finally, I am going to draw the implications for the field of development studies. We have to look at them here. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Here. Technology is not my thing. Always failed with me. My son said that I am technologically challenged. Okay, so let's start with the first approach, that is modernization theory. And as you remember, just a brief mention, it is the perfect example that believed that there was one world and that everybody has to follow the same pattern that the countries that develop face. And also because they believe that people from the developed world has all the answers, so they declare that we have the knowledge to teach the rest of the world how to develop. The only way to doing that was assimilating, that they will forget their traditions, their thinking, and assimilate in what they believe was the example of the first world. And as an Indian author, Chakravarti says, the problem is that they put all the countries in the waiting room of history. We have that, the classical example, it will be Rostow models of economic growth, that everybody was going to go in that step from the traditional to what he called the mass consumption. And economics was like the science also to help this development. The dependency theory did a very important role criticizing modernization theory. They were successful. It was a Marxist approach, as I said, and what they did was to relate countries in the core and with the periphery, and showing how that relationship not always produced development, but also produced underdevelopment, because one of the factors, not all, it was the unequal terms of trade. They were successful in terms of the policy of substitution, import substitution, industrialization, but I think that they also were had the image that there is only one world. They were capital-centric, that is, the only focus was in capitalism and labor and capital, but they forgot that outside this world there are indigenous, there are afro-descendants, that there are unemployed, that there are peasants, and also they forgot that something very important are the not only production, but also the reproduction of life and care and these kind of things. So they were unequal, unsuccessful in that sense. So the three things that I will say from these both approaches is that they assume, because that there is unlimited growth. They didn't take care of outside, and also economics was important, and they didn't look, for example, at what was the impact of unlimited growth on nature and on the environment. And the alternative was assimilation. Fortunately or unfortunately, I don't know yet, but the problem is that, or the issue is that toward the last part of the previous century, there was a crisis in the world, and this crisis opened new answers. And one of the things that was visible at that moment was the increase and the mainly big conflicts because of projects of mining, big mining exploration, hydrocarbon development, and these things were mainly in indigenous territory. This is a map made by the Economic Commission of Latin America, and what it shows is where the conflicts for mining, that is in red, and hydrocarbons, that is in blue, conflicts in indigenous territories. So it was common in Latin America, these conflicts for territories. But what I argue, and I think, is that the conflict was more and beyond the impact on their territories. I'm going to argue that the conflict was mainly about, it was an ontological conflict. That is, that what these activities did was to show how they were destroying words and ways of being, especially of indigenous and Afro-descendant communities. This war, it was not a new war. We look at what happened during the encounter with Western countries and indigenous people in the Americas. What we see is that at this moment, practically there was a declaration of war, of the ways of living of indigenous people in the Americas. And this declaration centered, or the main argument used at that moment, is that indigenous people didn't know how to cultivate the land. And because they didn't know how to cultivate the land, there were not going to be a progress. And that gave the European, or in this case, Spaniards, the right over the land of indigenous population. So that was an open war against indigenous people, and also at that moment, the bringing of slaves was also a war against this population. One first step at that moment, going back to the 20th century, was the Zapatista's declaration in 1994, the day that the free trade agreement was signed, when they openly claimed and said, we want a world where many worlds fit. So the problem was clearly identified as what we are seeing is a conflict between our indigenous worlds and the other Western or capitalist world. I don't know. This is okay. So that brings me to what do I understand by complex development? And fundamentally, what I am going to argue is that with this view of multiple worlds, modernity appears as one of possible worlds, but it was not the only one. Again, using the concept of Chakrabarti, modernity was provincialized. Don't think of modernity as the only answer, but one among many answers. And very important, this complex development changed the place of politics. That is that politics is not only the politics of the state and political parties, but also, as we will see in the case of Bolivia, politics happens in the most unexpected places. We see indigenous manifestation in public places, in road marches and that, and for actors that nobody thought that they were going to be political. I remember, and maybe you have read the very important scholar Hobsbawm, that has written beautiful things about the history of the world. When he wrote about peasants' revolution and peasants' uprising, he called the book Primitive Rebels. So he believed that primitive people, or in this case peasants or indigenous people, could not do a revolution because they were not enlightened enough to do so. They needed the direction of a political party. And what we are seeing is that this place of who makes politics is different. And also that there is the possibility of reaching agreements between different worlds. And the example that I think popularized Derrida and Deleuze was that we don't need to be common, so that is in a conflict, we don't need to be the same, but rather being different, we can to arrive to an agreement, like the case of the orchid and the wasp, that each one had their own interests and benefits, but they continue being different. This view of complex development is informed at the moment by several approaches, but in my case, I use a lot the what is called political ontology, that is the work on Marisol de la Cadena, Mario Blaser, Arturo Escobar. So let's move for the case of what, no, I think I lost one. Oh yeah, exactly, because this is an important concept. And important, and it's a book that really has a big impact on me, is the book of Marisol de la Cadena called Earth Beings. And Earth Beings is his field work, not in Bolivia. She went to do she was doing her research in Cusco. And she has as interlocutor to indigenous activists, Nazario and Father Azón. And she tells the story of one day there was a big demonstration in Cusco against a multinational that wanted to destroy a mountain to have a mining operation. And she was there with him, and Marisol, PhD from Berkeley, told him, yes, it's so good that we are going to do the demonstration because the multinational do that and that. And Nazario told her, No, the problem is that I also know the mountain, the name of that they gave to the mountain was Ausagante. And he said, yeah, I know that Ausagante, I know Ausagante. I have been in contact with Ausagante for a long, long time, and Ausagante doesn't want the destruction of the mountain. Ausagante will be mad if we destroy that mountain. And they will punish us if we are going to allow. So that gave a whole thinking to Marisol about how when we talk to people from other worlds, there is something that we are not able to grasp. And we don't grasp that because there is an excess on the way of life that we cannot capture. And that excess comes, as I mentioned before, from the colonial times when we have been telling indigenous peoples forever that your world is not part of modernity. Your world doesn't exist. There is no possibility that one world like yours, is going to be possible. So in that case, when we find even in our sentence today about acknowledging the territory, there is the sentence, we offer our gratitude to the first people for their care, teachings, and about earth and our relations. So there is a view within this community that this separation that we made in modernity between human and nature is not part of a lot of their cosmovisions. The same, for example, I have done research in Colombia with afro descendant communities, and also for some of this community, territory is part of their being. That is, we are with a territory. That's a very important thing. So when we talk with somebody from this community, there is an interruption. There is something that we are not able to capture. But that's very important about how we are going to go with trying to get, and as I mentioned with the example of the wasp and the orchid, how we found points of interest without destroying or without giving that the only assimilation is, the only solution is assimilation. Or, and that's another important part when I use the word that these conflicts are ontological conflicts, it's important because before, and even today, we say, the problem is that you have beliefs, and that beliefs are not true. You have beliefs and we have knowledge. So it's a problem between knowledge and beliefs, because our thing is about science and about rationality. So in that sense, we destroy, that's why we entered into this, what we call ontological conflicts. So as I already mentioned that, I'll maybe put it in the context of the example, of the previous example, is that the indigenous people are bringing to politics earth beings, are bringing the possibility that there are in nature there are things that are part of nature, that they have connection between humans and nature. So how to deal with these areas, and also that there are connections between humans, that means that the world could be an interrelated world, not a world of isolated individuals. So let's move into the case of Bolivia. As I mentioned, I am not going to capture everything, I just choose some examples. As one of the fascinating things about Bolivia, Bolivia has the highest percentage of indigenous people compared to the total population. In Latin America, in general, there are like 45 million indigenous people, and there are 8% of the population. There are countries like Mexico that have 150 million indigenous people, so there are bigger than in the case of Bolivia, but percentually Bolivia is important. And another difference in Bolivia, that you are going to have opportunity to travel, is that there are big differences between the indigenous from the altiplano and indigenous from the lowland. Generally, most of the indigenous from the altiplano that are in this left margin, the Quechuas and Aymara, are the majority of the population, and the lowlands near the Amazon and are most a lot of different indigenous groups that talk about different, I think like 30 different languages, and there are very small groups. I remember the first time that I went to the lowlands with my research assistant, I met with a group of women from the lowlands, indigenous, and they say, oh, that the colonizadores come and they are doing this and they are taking our territory, and the colonizadores are the ones that they are invading our territories. And I say, colonizadores? I couldn't understand. You know? So I didn't ask. When I went out, I asked my research assistant, who are the colonizadores? And she said, colonizadores are the indigenous from the altiplano. So that's another example of equivocation, that is that we not always talk about the same. Okay, so one of the things that is important that you will see all the time in Bolivia is that politics, I am using a concept of Jacques Rancière, politics takes in places that are not supposed to be political. No? In the case of Bolivia, it's amazing how and I'm going to talk mainly to the movements that took place in 2009, 2010, that led to one of the most progressive constitutions in Latin America, as progressive, I would say, to the constitution to Ecuador. As you know, the constitution of Ecuador gave rights to nature, the first time in the world that rights are given constitutionally. Bolivia was not done, but later on, after the constitution was approved, they approved a law of Mother Earth, or the Pachamama, as they say. This is a picture of, I think it's not in the 1990s, but okay, this is an example of how marches and road marches are very important point of politics, of mobilization, but also a lot of the thinking and the coalitions, and that happens in marches. In this case of the time before the Constitution, there came the indigenous people from the lowlands going up the Andes, and they met with the indigenous people of the highland. And as I mentioned, there were tensions in this case. There were a unity pact between these different indigenous organizations. Also, there were a big organization in Bolivia, the large organization of indigenous women, and not only indigenous, but also these marches were joined by peasants. So all together got together in this road, and starting with the idea of demanding a new constitution, and this pact between indigenous people were part of writing the new constitution. The constitution has a lot of changes, but it was a very important political, I will say, issue. But the other thing that happened during these marches is that there was a change in the demands for people, in the sense that in generally when the people think that indigenous need land, no? And something that I did mention in the revolution of 1952, that was a revolution inspired by Marxist thinking, very progressive. In that revolution, it was an important agrarian reform, and there was an important also, they gave citizenship to everybody, Bolivia, social change, it was important. But I think comes my reference to the thinking of only one word, that they gave the land to indigenous people, but says from now on, all the people, all the AILUs, and are the organization of indigenous in Bolivia, all the AILUs are going to be converted into trade unions. And you are not going to be called indigenous anymore. From now on, you are going to be called peasants. So again, the assimilation and the thinking about a single word. So here, indigenous people put the emphasis in how important was for them to not just to have land, but to have territories, and territories was part of the relationship between being with territory and living and respecting nature. The other important issue is, as I mentioned before, for modernity, indigenous people didn't exist in the sense that all the world and all the thinking was about modernity. But the word of indigenous people was meaningless, that they were not seen, their voice was not important, and part of these marches of this time, as one of them, Ruben Truco, an indigenous leader, said, the government must make Bolivian people aware that we exist and that we are humans and that we must share equality. So this he was thinking about being people, being humans. But also, and that's as important, is that not only knowledge came from universities or from ideologies or from that, but also how knowledge came from experience. Knowledge came from our bodies, what happened to our bodies. I think feminists are very important, putting this notion of emotions and affects and that on the table. Here said how the knowledge came, knowledge from and from their experience and the brutality that they were treated and the unfairness before. Now, as I mentioned, one of the main issues or my fixing in Bolivia was the political constitution that was signed during the time of Evo Morales, and this political constitution was, as I said, part of that unity, Pacto de Unidad, the Unity Pact, and the Constitution, one of the innovations is that declared Bolivia a communitarian state. Also, in the political constitution of Bolivia, the Constitution incorporates the ethics principle of indigenous people. One, and maybe the best known principle is what I call the buen vivir, that is the summa camaña, that is live well or live in harmony with others, or even marriage, that is earth without harm. I also have found the translation is live without evil, that is part of the cosmovision of indigenous people on the lowlands. Also, the Constitution includes different forms of democracy, but one of them is communitarian democracy, and indigenous people have, in Bolivia, has very important ways of how you relate to the land, how you take the decisions about who owns, or even if you go to another place, how you inherit and continue having access to the land. Also, everybody, this is the case of Argus, everybody needs to have responsibilities in the community. You cannot, you don't have mayors or that, like you are appointed and everybody forget about politics. No, they are all part of the decision-making process. And also there is the view of legal pluralism, and there is also the capitalist economy is also part of the Constitution, but also they talk about community or communal economy. How I am going of time? 5 minutes?
No, you're doing good.
Huh? Okay. Okay. No, almost finished. We want to have some discussion. As I mentioned before, the concept of summa camae is very important, and as Arturo Escobar said, this is important to think, to live not as individuals, but rather live relationally, have relationships with others, and have relationships with nature, etc. There is a Chilean indigenous woman that again this thing that we don't demand property over land. We propose a different art of inhabiting the earth. There are also movements of indigenous women, one of them called Buen Vivir, and about how the commitment is sustaining life. So it means a very important change in life. So let's move to what are the pedagogical implications of this approach. You are going to Bolivia, and I have some, as an older scholar, no, I have to give always advice. Okay, so and I have this picture that I love because she's Olivia Leru, is an indigenous leader that when I went to Bolivia, I didn't know who she was. And I hired her as my research assistant. And we worked together. And one day, because I think my relationship with her is like, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years, Cristina, more, okay. So one day, somebody made an interview to her, with her, and they asked, tell us, you are the granddaughter of one Lero, and her name is Toribia Quispe Lero, no? And then she told the story that, yes, she's the granddaughter of one of the most important indigenous leaders in Bolivia at the beginning of the 20th century. The story is beautiful, I cannot tell you, but oh my God. Okay. So, but this picture is because we went with Vladimir and Kirsten to visit to the islets in Bolivia. And it was very high and the very difficult path. And Olivia took my hand and guided me for part of the road. And I think it's emblematic of, if I know something about Bolivia today, is because I learned from Toribia. That is, I really learned on all our conversations with her. He was really sabio. How do you say sabio?
Wise.
Wise. Okay, a very wise person. So that is an important lesson from me. But I have some other advice that is given for other scholars that I think is important. One of them is an Australian scholar called Elaine Herrera. And she said an important concept for them is disconcernment. And she said that what you find, this work, she also works with indigenous peoples in Australia. She said epistemic disconcernment generate puzzles and has the potential to make us think, challenging what we know and how know. So if we compare with the attitude of the modernization theory, there is a big gap between thinking that we have the knowledge to develop or to civilize other people to this attitude of doubt and thinking twice about what we know. The other is Isabel Stengels, another anthropologist, and he wrote an article called Cosmopolitics. And at the beginning of this article, she said something important. She said, I wrote this article with one thing in mind. And the thing that I have in mind is to make a proposal, that this proposal provoke thought. And as a result of this proposal, we are going to slow down reasoning. So being able to go and to talk and say that what we think maybe is not what is right, but rather let's take our time and slow our thinking. I think it's a very wise way of thinking. And the other is Marisol de la Cadena, and an interview that somebody made to her, and this person asked her about the first interview that she has with Nazario Turpo, and she said, understanding as usual may never happen, that is maybe thinking like Mariano or Nazario was never going to think like them. It was almost impossible. No? But she said, but I continue my conversations with my friends. Ours are not two worlds, but they are not either one. Right. So that there is also this in between and this challenge to understand between one and the other. There are not two worlds, and maybe it's not only one. So how I continue thinking with that. And the other is a comment that Arturo Escobar made to her and said, approaching radical alterity means not to fully know the other in a rational sense, but also not to negate as unreal what exceeds our understanding. So how to take both issue and continue challenging. And I think that if you are able to do that, that is because, as I say, sometimes it's frightening because we are not accustomed to having this type of conversation between words. But keep trying and keep questioning your knowledge and not abandoning, I think, is the idea. And finally, I was going to say that, as this was a picture that I took in that trip, that you are going to be in the best hands when you are going to Bolivia with Kirsten. So, thank you very much.